oral history with Gene Goodwin, better known as Eugene Goodwin, Professor Emeritus and the former director of the School of Journalism at Penn State. The date is July the 14th. 14th is it, I believe? July the 14th, 2005. We're in Room 101 Carnegie Building, and the purpose is to get on the historical record one of the seminal figures in the School of Journalism in Carnegie Building, to get on the historical record his perspective. At the outset, it probably would be useful, Gene, if you would say for the record that this material is part of the public domain, and
Yes.
you're releasing it for
Yes.
general consumption.
My brains are available to all. What's left of them?
As we were saying before the tape started rolling, I haven't introduced Patrick and myself. Maybe that'd be a good idea. With Gene is Pat Parsons, a longtime member of the faculty, and I'm John Nichols, also a longer time member of the faculty. Patrick and I and Gene have not coordinated this in any way. It's strictly informal and unscripted, but I thought probably the best way to proceed is to first of all spend a couple of minutes on Gene yourself as a person. I mean, you'll start the basic biographical stuff, where you were born in Iowa, and your professional career, and what led you to Penn State and Carnegie Building, and then we'll pick up maybe a second stage. That first could be fairly brief, but at the second stage, maybe we can talk about the historical record of your experience in Carnegie Building and the School of Communications, and then maybe the third part would be more philosophical or conceptual about what you think about what's transpired in your rather lengthy career. Is that a reasonable way to proceed?
Sounds okay to me.
So why don't you lead off, Gene, and just give us a brief personal biography and the professional biography that led you to the college.
I understand the guy who's 82 and a half years old is liable to suffer from dementia, and one of the things you have if you have some of the health problems I have is you've got to put up with these neurologists asking these questions of you. It's like the old tests when we used to have in some of our current affairs courses. We'd try to encourage our students to keep up with the news by asking questions, and that's what neurologists, they're always interested in who the hell the president was before Ford or after Ford. Ford's a tough one for people because they forget he was ever president. So it's a tough one. And last time I had one of these tests was at Mayo in Jacksonville, Florida, and I passed 30 out of 30 because the kind young woman who was associated with the doctor I was seeing excused one of my missed questions having to do with the knowledge of the county that Jacksonville is in. I just remember Jacksonville as being the most aggressive city in Florida. It's always expanding, so I assumed it had its own county. So I said it must be Jacksonville. No, it's not. It's got a name, another county. I forget what it is, so I'll miss it next time too. But other than that, I'm pretty sharp apparently. I can tell you who the presidents were before Reagan and back before Eisenhower even. And I don't know how I have that kind of memory, but I do. Let's see.
You came, speaking of presidents, you came to Penn State under Eric Walker.
Eric Walker, tough guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was sort of the John Wayne type of the presidents. Before we got into these more diplomatic guys, he was like a candid, blunt speaker like me. That's why we got along pretty well. I was not close to him because we were blunt against on opposite sides of many issues, but I respected Eric Walker, and to this day I will defend him as a president. He was a great advocate for Penn State, just the right kind of temperament for that moment. Wouldn't probably go today at all, but he fit what we had to do at that time. So I'm an admirer of his. He's long gone, of course. He lived down the valley for a while after he retired. But that's a long time ago. Well, I came from Council Bluffs, Iowa. That's a little town across from Omaha, Nebraska. I was born there 1922. Yeah, 1922. See, I can remember that. And I went to the University of Iowa not because I thought the University of Iowa was a great place to go, but because it was the only place I could afford to go. My folks had moved to Baltimore, and I went to high school in Baltimore, thank God. but I got a wonderful education there. I didn't know how good it was. I just, I took the courses they took, and it turned out I was about a sophomore when I got to Iowa instead of a freshman, because I passed out of the science requirement, the language requirements, and 2 or 3 other things. I'd already had it. This all-boys high school they called Baltimore City College. They still call it that. And I brought with me a couple of people from Baltimore City College who worked on the student paper with me, who were journalism majors at Iowa. Same time, we all went into the service because of the time. 1941. I got there in 41. They got there in 41, 42. And all of us had to get into the service. There was no choice unless we were crippled. And that didn't come till later in life. We were perhaps dangerous for other reasons, but I won't get into that. But we all went into service and came back to Iowa. And eventually, all but one of us got degrees from Iowa. One of them is still working in journalism. The other one's retired, like me, retired, semi-retired, I guess is a better word. Let's see, I came to Penn State in '57, but it's important for you to understand that the reason I came to Penn State had nothing to do with Penn State so much as it did with the people who I knew who came there. Milton Eisenhower was president of Penn State. Remember that?
Mm-hmm. He preceded Walker.
Yeah, great guy, too. He was brother of the president and a well-known educator from out the Kansas way. Kansas State, I believe, is where he was before he came here. And a very good man who went from here to Hopkins, where he was president of Hopkins. And he brought with him from Kansas Larry Dennis, who was a personal friend of mine, who brought in with him a guy named Keith Spaulding, who became president of Franklin Marshall. These guys are out of the newspaper business. Keith Spaulding was working for the New York Herald Tribune, fine newspaper of the old days, remember? He came in as a speechwriter for Milton Eisenhower. And he was so good, Milton Eisenhower took him to Hopkins with him. But for a while, he was at Penn State about 3 years. Larry Dennis was the vice president for academic affairs was the title at that time. It was a provost job, a sort of job, head of faculty, head of academic matters. Well, at Iowa, after the war, he and I and several other people got together to form a group called the Iowa chapter of the American Veterans Committee. That was an attempt to create an organization of veterans that did something besides drink booze and march in parades and try to take care of themselves. Sort of the Greed Corps that we saw, the American Legion, Veterans for Foreign Wars, those groups representing. We tried to start a new group, a different kind of veterans group that would fight for peace, try to remind people what war was like instead of, and one of our things, we wouldn't march in Memorial Day and 4th of July parades. We wouldn't give you colors and that sort of crap. And we wouldn't have any bars. Very idealistic group. That's why we didn't survive, I guess. Anyway, we started that chapter at Iowa, and that's how we got to know one another. We had an attempt by a left-wing communist group to take over the organization. That was true in all the student groups at the time. They were particularly wanted to take ours over. So we got familiar with the tactics of the far left wing, and that was a political education in itself. And we used some of their tactics later on when we needed them to try to accomplish some goals of our own in the organization, which, as I said, didn't make it. It was a good idea, though. I still believe that I don't belong to the American Legion of Veterans for Foreign War, and I couldn't to this day. Or AMVETS, they have a little chapter in Florida where I live now, and they have a nice bar. They're after me all the time to come be a social member, and I can't do that. I just can't. My ideals won't let me do that anymore. Because anyway, I met these people, and Larry Dennis particularly, and Keith Spaulding then became friends in the academic world. And when I visited them, they tried to talk me into joining them. Keith didn't have any advanced degrees. I had a master's degree in journalism and political science, but no PhD. Neither did he. He later became president of Franklin Marshall. They didn't seem to care. He's a damn good president, the best they ever had down there, I think. He did great things for that small college in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And he became at Johns Hopkins was secretary of the faculty. I don't think we have a comparable job at Penn State that I can describe, but it's an important job. It's like the clerk of a Quaker meeting house. You know what I mean? They call him clerk, but it's really the boss. They don't have a clergy, so it's really the boss guy. he decides when they're going to meet, and if they ever have a problem, how they're going to deal with it. They don't talk during their religious services, so they can't democratically thrash things out that way. They have to figure out other ways to achieve a democratic decision, and the clerk is very important in that role. Well, the faculty secretary at Johns Hopkins the same way. Well, because Milton Eisenhower's backing, he got this job when it opened at Hopkins. And Milton used to take care of his boys. That's how Larry got taken care of. Larry stayed at Penn State because when Milton left, he was vice president for academic affairs. I mean, he came in as a speechwriter, as a press guy, public relations type advisor, and he ended up, because he did have a PhD almost, he hadn't completed, he never did complete as far as I know. No, I don't think he ever did complete it. But these people were instrumental in my coming to Penn State. So there is an old boys network operating in the world, as far as I know anyway. Old girls networks operate as well.
What got you interested in journalism in the first place?
Oh, well, this student newspaper in my high school, I think, and the fact that at the high school I went to in Baltimore, if you could pass out of the English competence test, you could take the journalism course. I mean, you couldn't take journalism unless you were better than any other student, and we had to pass the same usage grammar test as anybody else. And it was a junior-senior course in journalism. They called it journalism. Actually, it was English with some journalism putting out the paper. The guy who taught the course had worked for the Baltimore Sun. That's about what made it journalism. But he was an English teacher, and we got, as I said, the standard English grammar stuff, as well as some journalism. We got to put out the student newspaper once a week. And I was sports editor first because I was interested in sports. I played football as a freshman in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and I went to Baltimore, and I was going to be a big athlete. 2,400 boys. You make the sophomore team there, you've got to be pretty special. I made it. I almost got killed. They decided I was an lineman. I wasn't any bigger then than I am right now. 160-pound linemen don't survive well in high school with 2,400 boys. I got smashed about the third game, and I spent most of the rest of the time on the sick list and decided I better find another. I made the tennis team. That's more my sport. I was known as that. I played in my junior year, and I was known as the specialist in triples. I sat on the bench, so I didn't get in a single game, but he said, if anybody dies, you got to be ready. So the coach encouraged me. I wasn't that good a tennis player either. I was good enough for Iowa. Council Bluffs, I'd have been a star, probably. There were only 4 guys turned out for tennis, as I recall, there, and Baltimore, there were 40. Anyway, it's a whole different experience, and I decided journalism was the way to do it. So I started writing about sports, and it was fun. Being sports editor of a high school paper that had sports of all sorts that I never seen before, like lacrosse. Council Bluffs boys doesn't know about lacrosse. You had to learn a game like that. We had sailing teams, things like that I never knew existed because of its location. So it was a good experience, and I made, when I was editor, I can't think of anything except it brought my grade point average down when I was editor because I spent so much time with the paper. I didn't get the A's I could have gotten. I got a couple of B's. And a couple of professors were kind enough to write on it. You could have, if you hadn't spent so damn much time with the paper, you would have probably gotten an A. Gene, they said nice things like that. That was good. And we had PhD teachers in the faculty there. It was unusual high school. It still is that way, I'm told. Although it's illegal, of course, to have all boys schools, so they have boys and girls. And thank God they have all colors, boys and girls. When I was there, they didn't admit to the fact that these were only white boys. I didn't even notice it at the time, but I now know that I was in a segregated school system as well as one that separated people by gender, so it was really ancient. But they had a sense of quality that I was praising earlier, and that's why I was glad I went there. I'm wandering too far here.
Well, you had some professional experience before you came to Penn State.
Oh, I had a lot of professional experience. I didn't intend to go into education. I got the master's degree, frankly, because when I came back from the war, I really had a yen to get back into things, and into things meant getting back to the classroom for me. And I was a very good student when I came back. I was full of curiosity. I mean, the best kind of curiosity, if you know what I mean, in your best graduate students. The kind you can never satisfy. They're always champing at the bit. You got to send them out of the room because you can't satisfy them. There's no way, because you have to admit how much you don't know, and that's hard for most of us. So you have to send them elsewhere. Anyway, I was that kind of graduate student, if you know what I mean. And And anyway, they told me I was going to get my degree after 2 semesters. I'd only been to college about 5 semesters, but they gave you all these things for. I got 12 credits for astronomy because I was a navigator in the 8th Air Force. They decided I knew a lot about astronomy because I could fly an airplane by the stars, but that's not astronomy. And I gave me 12 credits of military, the least military man that was ever in the Air Force. I got 12 credits of advanced ROTC on my record, things like that. So I got they said I was going to graduate in June. I just barely got back, I came in September, and I went to see director of school of journalism, see if I could stay around, get a master's degree, and he said, sure. I didn't want to spend more than a year, though. I had my requirements. I wanted to get out after a year. By God, I made it. I did. Art Barnes was my thesis advisor, and with his help, we got the whole thing accomplished.
Art Barnes was your thesis advisor?
Yeah. I didn't have any courses under him, but he was my thesis advisor. I do remember I learned from him there's a difference between unique and unusual. A lesson I learned to this day. I see it violated by professional writers every day. I never violate it. Unique means first and only, and you shouldn't call anything unique unless it is the first and only. And I made the mistake of using the word unique to describe some method I was using, and I couldn't prove it was the first time it had been used, and so I had to take it out. And so that's what I remember from Art. He was very helpful. Actually, I wouldn't have gotten it through that summer if it hadn't been for his help, I don't think. But I had the head of the political science department, and the other guy was Wilbur Schramm was on my committee. He was director of school of journalism. You know him? You know that name?
Schramm was the director at Iowa when you were there for your math?
And on your committee.
On my committee. So I had quite a oral examination for a master's student. I deserved the beer they bought me after. I'll tell you, it was quite a fight. It was fun. I look back on it now as being a very educational experience. All afternoon we spent together. They were having a ball because the head of the political science department thought that the director of school of journalism was encouraging graduate students to do the wrong things. He was into quantitative stuff. He was trying to establish a Bureau of Newspaper Research. He was trying to get the publishers of Iowa to support this project. And I did a readership study of the daily paper for 7 straight days. Now, I did this, of course, with the help of about 200 students who were assigned to do this work with me. So it was something I couldn't accomplish without the school's help. And he was trying to build up the file, and he wanted to show that if you had a week-long experience with readership, with audience surveys, that you could really draw conclusions that were helpful and could even make money from that sort of thing. Wilbur Schramm was not dummy at all. He was a very practical guy. He wrote a lot of stuff, far-fetched stuff. Remember, he was a fiction writer as well as a fact guy in the early days. He used to write about the donkey who played third base for the Brooklyn Dodgers, things like that. Sort of children's books for adults, I call him. And big guy, very imaginative guy. And anyway, he encouraged me to do. It was his idea that I run this survey, this study, and report on it. And he published it afterward as one of the first publications of the Bureau of Newspaper Research at the University of Iowa. It was later expanded by others, but I was the first. And the head of the political science department thought this was a sellout sort of thing, exploiting graduate students and that sort of thing. And I didn't know what to make of this, so I just listened mostly as these guys battled one another, these two power brokers at the University of Iowa battled one another over my dead body. And finally, Art steered them back to a couple of questions about me, and we finally finished and they gave me my degree. I went to work for the Baltimore Sun then, on the copy desk. I got the job because I'd been in Baltimore, really. They wanted somebody with my background. They liked the master's degree, the fact that I'd been in the Air Force. I'd been an officer, I'd been a lead navigator in B-17s in the 8th Air Force. They liked that stuff. They made a big play of that in the announcement when they hired me. And they put me on the copy desk, which is not where I wanted to be on the newspaper. I respected the newspaper. It was a good paper, but I didn't see myself as a copy desk guy at that time. But I stayed for about 8 months, and I had some friends who were working for the AP, the old Boys Bureau. The Associated Press was right in the same building. And I applied they had an opening and I applied. My 2 friends spoke for me and I got the job. And the Sun had to release me, and they told me then they had other things in mind for me. They were going to take me off the copy desk and let me go cover the Maryland legislatures, which is one of the things I said I wanted to do. But they didn't get around to doing it, and so I said no thanks. They offered me a job, and I stayed with the AP for 2 years. So I spent about 3 years in Baltimore, and in the meantime I was going over to Washington, applying at the Post and the Star. You don't know the Star, you guys, but the Star was a great.
Star was still around when I was.
Great newspaper, great newspaper. It was run by two families, completely independent at that time. Two families that took their jobs, their roles as newspaper publishers very seriously. Kaufman's and Noyes families, and treated us like we were family. I mean, they gave you cash every Friday, and gave you a week's bonus every Christmas. You know, old-fashioned kind of stuff nobody does anymore. They had their own dentist. They had doctors in the office in their office building on 11th and Pennsylvania. I drove by it the other day. It's still there. I think it's been declared a historical building now. You can't change this facade. It's got a Baroque facade. It's across from the old post office building. If you're on Pennsylvania Avenue, you can picture that in your mind. It's a beautiful place. It was unair conditioned, however, and Washington summers were as bad then as they are now. But I got a job on the Star. The Post then came, after 3 months I was on the Star, the Post made a big grab for me. They finally had an opening that they thought suited me, and they thought I don't know that they were going to go after me 3 months late. And I said, yeah, it's just, you're 3 months late, and you've been 3 months late ever since I've been in town, and you're going to get 3 months late when I leave this place. I'm sorry, you know. I really was offended that they did that. They tried to steal me because I was embarrassing their reporters out in the field already. They had a bunch of names, people who had forgotten how to walk. They did all those stories by telephone, you know. I never worked that way. Star let me be a reporter, let me be a writer, and I loved that. That's what I should have been doing. I could have been happy if I'd done that the rest of my life. But every place I'd gone, they tried to get me in on the desk. And when I went to Penn State, I had the choice of becoming assistant national editor of the Star or going to Penn State. They wanted me as assistant national editor because they had an opening, and they wanted me inside. They wanted me calling the shots because I went to cover Republican National Convention in San Francisco in 1956 as a reporter. That was a convention, you may recall, where Eisenhower was running for re-election, and Nixon. The big problem was whether he was going to keep Nixon. That's the only issue we had, other than where we were going to eat dinner that night. That's the only thing we could talk about. I mean, there was nothing to talk. There was no convention to cover. It was all cut and dry. Democrats had a very exciting one, and the Republicans had a dull one. And I got assigned to the Republican one because I was supposed to be the expert on McKeldin, the governor of Maryland at that time, and he was going to be a big man in this convention. It turned out that was wrong too. He didn't exploit he didn't take advantage of the opportunity, or something happened. He took a back seat instead of the forward seat. Everybody thought he was going to be thought he was going to make a bid to be vice president. Well, it'd been a disaster if he had been, but that's neither here nor there. He didn't, and I didn't have a story to cover except the report that McClellan decided against the idea. And after I wrote that, that was all. So I was in the advance team, so I couldn't be in Chicago at the same time where the Democrats were. Anyway, I broke a couple stories, though, that were interesting enough to the national desk. They began to see that they had a real reporter. They had noticed it was working. I was on the state desk, and I covered Maryland, Virginia, politics mostly. And so they got interested, and they wanted to grab me. And they said assistant national editor didn't mean I wouldn't be writing, but they didn't have an assignment. They had these old guys who'd been with them forever who covered the House, Senate, covered the important federal offices, and they were all assigned, and I could see what was. It's like Mary McGrory. She couldn't get on there either. You know, the famous Mary McGrory. She was in the library, and she was in line to be on the national desk. They finally needed a reporter to cover the McCarthy hearing. Nobody wanted to cover the damn thing. Can you imagine that? Well, that's where she made her reputation, remember? She's a great job. Mary was one of the people who was sent to San Francisco with me. I learned that if you're going to work with Mary McGrory, you have to be two things. You have to make sure she gets breakfast at the right time, and she always asked somebody from the staff. She didn't arrange these things. And you had to be prepared for her to call you occasionally to zip up her dresses. She loved zip, but she didn't have any. She could never work one of those things that women use to pull zip. You had to be old enough to be able to do that without blushing, and young enough to so she would not be fearful of you, I guess, or strong enough so you could pull the zipper. You know, I learned the zipper technique from Mary McGrory. Great woman, great writer, wonderful writer, wonderful sense of humor, just a wonderful person. Anyway, she and I were together trying to get on the national staff. And I went to Penn State. She got on the national staff by waiting her time. But she waited for 2 years, writing book reviews, 2 years in the library, working in the library, not the Library of Congress, but the Library of the Star, waiting to get a chance to show them she could write stuff besides book reviews. It's a tougher time to get in, particularly if you're a woman in those days. Well, the Star did better than most people. You know, if you look back at the history of the Pulitzer Prizes, you see that the Star won Pulitzer Prizes when women in that period right after World War II because these fill-in jobs had been given to these gals who were too damn good, and they had to keep them on, and they started winning Pulitzer Prizes. Mary Lou Werner was one of them for covering segregation in the state of Virginia. Hell of a reporter. Another woman who was not a very pleasant person, Mary McGrory, won one, and there's another gal, I forgot her name now, but it'll come to me. This is the dementia coming in, guys. It'll come to me in the middle of the night, and I'll say, God, why didn't I think of that name? But they won Pulitzer Prizes. These were females. You know, that was unusual in those days for anybody in journalism. That's when I came to Penn State. I found that we had a population at that time in the School of Journalism enrollment about 4 men to every single woman. That was true in the whole university. That's the reason we had it. We were not out of proportion with College of Liberal Arts had more girls than that, but School of Journalism was more like College of Engineering and Physics and things like that. Disgraceful. We turned that around right away.
What attracted you to coming to Penn State?
Well,
in addition to your connections.
Well, the connection, let's say I'd always had an interest in teaching. I really did. As a graduate student, in addition to editing the paper and doing this wild survey, 7-day survey of the Daily Iowan readership with Wilbur Schramm as my director, looking over my shoulder every day. As I'd bring the figures in, he'd look at everyone. You sure this is right? I don't know. They're your students, Dr. Schramm. You know, that sort of stuff. And in addition to doing that, they created a laboratory for the first time. They had a guy there who became director of one of the schools of journalism somewhere, went to Michigan State. Well-known name at the time, I forgot his name too. But anyway, he was working on his PhD at Iowa, one of the first of the crowd to get a communications PhD. And he was running a...
It wasn't Ev Rogers.
Yeah, that's who.
Was it Ev Rogers?
Yeah, and he was working on in a lab, using a laboratory approach to teaching news writing. You know, by bringing students in as if they were in a newsroom and sending them out on assignment, and they'd come back and they'd all write the story right there under time pressure, that sort of thing. Well, he needed somebody to dream up the assignments. He didn't know the town very well. Something that we keep in time, you know, like covering a council meeting or something like that, and I could judge the facts. And he hired me as a sort of a extra pay. He noted I was hungry for money. By then I had 3 children I had to feed, in addition to my wife, who had a nice appetite too. And so I took that job in addition to everything else. And I graded, and ended up being his grader. And he was impressed with that. And I was impressed with doing that sort of work. I thought that was a good way to make a living. So I had a little of that in me. And also Wisconsin, after I went with the Sun, Wisconsin tried to get me to be a graduate assistant. They offered me a graduate assistant job and part-time teaching and working on PhD. But you know, by then I was really had to worry about my family. I didn't want to be poor. I've been poor long enough, you know. The Air Force didn't overpay either. You might have captain's bars or something. I didn't say I got first lieutenant, but you may have captain's bars. That's what they offered me to keep me in. But you didn't make much money in the Air Force in those days, being a captain. And I had a family, and I had an idea what you ought to do with a family. You shouldn't keep them poor and in rags. And I was interested in getting a little better slice of the economic pie, so to speak. And Wisconsin was in no better shape than any other school then. When they went out to hire graduate assistants, they're talking about slave, you know, minimum wage stuff, the way we still do, I guess. And I just wasn't interested. But I was tempted. I really was tempted. I liked the faculty members who I talked to when I went out to interview, and I almost took it anyway. But Fanny said, no, come on. You just got this new job, you're doing fine. I was getting $75 a week. $75 a week, can you imagine that kind of money? That's what I started at. there were instructors, assistant professors at Iowa that were not making that kind of money at that time. Now we're talking about 1946. That's the kind of money that you could make. And anyway, I was interested in trying to establish myself economically. And by the time Penn State offer got in, by the time I'd been to work in the field 10 years and the Penn State offer came in, it was $10,600 a year to be director of the School of Journalism on a 12-month basis. And that was $2,000 more than I was making on the Washington Star as the top reporter for the state desk. I was making more than anybody else in the state desk, but it was only $8,600. And when the Star found out how much Penn State was willing to pay, they couldn't believe it. They came back with something like 10,000, but they couldn't get quite up to 10,600. That's what I can remember those figures. That's what I came here for.
What year was that, Gene?
1957. But I came because of Larry Dennis. They had the School of Journalism had been created in 1955. They had a big study. They created the School of Arts, School of Journalism within the College of Liberal Arts at that time. And the School of the Arts which later became Arts and Architecture, it was created at the same time as well. That was started out liberal arts and then was broken off and become independent. But they hired a guy from, God, I wish I could remember his name. He was director of the School of the Arts. They were very happy with him. He didn't have an academic background. He's been an artist, and he had a museum director, administrative job, and a very imaginative guy. And they took a chance on everybody. He never had any education background, no PhDs, no degrees in the field sort of thing. But he turned out very well, so they were in the mood to try somebody like me. And they had gone through, the year before, they'd gone through a search in which they had 32 people on their long list, and they interviewed something like 16 of the 32. And they hired Bill Cole from Illinois, who'd been an assistant to the director of the School of Journalism at the University of Illinois. The guy who was the legal scholar who went to Michigan State. What the hell was
The legal scholar of Illinois?
Yeah.
Siebert?
Fred Siebert. Fred Siebert was the non-administrative administrator. Remember, you get these nice scholars to take jobs like that, and they didn't know how to buy paper clips. They knew how to find out about the Cherry Sisters versus the Des Moines Register, but they didn't know how to find a place to buy decent. They didn't know where Staples was, that sort of thing. And he had to have an administrative assistant because he couldn't do anything. And Bill Cole was highly respected by people who knew what was going on in Illinois because he really ran the place. So Penn State felt very happy to get Bill Cole. Now, he was a non-PhD also. And Bill Cole had sort of journalism experience that you get in the Navy, sort of military, public relations, public information kind of experience. And but he was a respected guy. And he came here, and within a year, before the year was out, Northwestern had hired him to be the dean at Northwestern. So Penn State, going through this big search, exhausted themselves, and they got a guy, and he left them before the year was out. So they had one guy they didn't get to interview. They wanted to reconsider, a Florida man, and Larry threw my name into the pot just at the right time because they were desperate. And I was called up here, and they called the guy from Florida, and I made him look like a kindergarten teacher. Apparently, he was not too sharp. I'm not even going to tell you his name, but he was been on their list, and he retired at Florida. He was an okay guy, but he was not ready for this job, and so I didn't have much opposition. And it was almost take Goodwin or nobody sort of. So in competition with nobody, it's easy to win, and I won that one. And so certain things happened. Like I didn't know what tenure was, but I had a friend named Bob Iverson who came to this university as a faculty member in the Center for Continuing Liberal Education. It was established in the College of Liberal Arts with Ford Foundation money. He taught here for about 5 years. He was a historian. And Bob told me, he said, they say anything, after I've been interviewed, they say anything about tenure? And I said, no, tell them you want full tenure. I didn't even know what it asked for. So when Dean Ewing from the College of Liberal Arts called me, he said, well, here's what we can offer you. And I'll put it in writing. And he said, now, we want to know if you have any questions. I said, how about tenure? Could I have full tenure? Sure, he said, you can have full tenure. He gave it to me. I got full tenure. I stepped foot on this place, and I didn't even know what I had. They wouldn't believe me, and he put it in writing, so I had it. So I never went through any review committees or any of that stuff. I was a full professor too. I came in as a full professor. That was policy then. If you were going to run the place, you had to be full professor. So I was full professor with full tenure, and what a weird situation. I could have taken advantage of them if I had known what I was getting. I couldn't take advantage of it. I didn't know what I had. I learned that very quickly, of course, but it was wonderful, weird, wild thing that they would take a chance like that. But I think there was a little desperation on the faculty at the time, because I didn't have any contacts on the faculty at all. I didn't know any of those folks. I had to meet them for the first time. And I didn't let on that I found them a little weak in the head, some of them. But, they were not strong. It was not a strong faculty. I don't know whether some of the names you knew, like this strong guy was Markham. He was a star. And you know what a star he was. He had a PhD from the University of Missouri. He'd written a couple of OK Bovard, the managing editor of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, was his PhD dissertation, and he turned that into a book, remember? And but then he got into the international stuff. I don't know where Bovard got him to international, but he was not as much of a scholar even, I didn't think. That kind of stuff, I was not impressed with his faculty at all. Except Charlie Brown. I liked the way he wrote. And Charles Brown, whose book is up there, Informing the People, I noticed that. Charles Brown was a real scholar of the language. Very temperamental guy, very hard to live with. But he was the only one, it seemed to me, that had any merit to speak of. I mean, and then I met Eric Walker during the interview, and he handed me a catalog. Now, this is a true story. I'm going to tell you this. He handed me a catalog as a journalism faculty, and he crossed out all but 3 names. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, if you end up just with those 3 guys, I'd be happy. And he had this. That's what he tells me. And crossed out are they've created 2 departments, one of advertising and one of journalism, and the 2 department heads are crossed out. So I'm supposed to fire these guys, in other words. I assume that's what he meant. I know you couldn't, I didn't realize that at the time I was being interviewed, you don't do that in academics. I learned that right away. You don't fire anybody, I mean, you don't fire faculty. You have to find them on some sort of crime of moral turpitude or something before you can get rid of them. And these guys all are tenured. They had tenure that I didn't realize what it meant, as I said. I learned that stuff real fast, but I had to really go through a learning course very quickly. Larry was around, and I'd come home every day on the phone if I didn't see him and ask him these dumb questions. He said, ask me anything, there are no dumb questions, and he was good about that. He filled me in from his point of view, of course. His point of view, I'd find out in the council of the other department heads in the Council of Liberal Arts was frequently not the one supported by all the faculty, because he was a mover and shake. He wanted to move this place toward general education. You remember that battle? Toward courses in which the disciplines would take responsibility for taking what was important in their discipline and teaching it to everybody, not just teaching it to themselves, sort of, a little research-oriented departments. And he was pushing real hard for that, pushing so hard that he was getting to be very unpopular. He had more enemies in the College of Liberal Arts than any other place, because that's where he had to work. That's where if he's going to get anywhere to create a new academic curriculum in this university, he had to get it out of liberal arts. He wasn't going to get it out of the sciences. Well, in the end, the sciences, some of the weirder guys in science, some of the people liked the idea of teaching those general science courses. And had some, remember the guy who used to have the elements in chemistry represented by cheerleaders? Girls from cheerleaders house, and he'd have them running through. No, it's kidding. What was his name? God, he was great. He got the Distinguished Teaching Award. He was really good. He lived in the community. He got in trouble. He got arrested. He got arrested for picketing. And all I remember, he was a great bridge player too. God, see, this is the trouble when you get old. All these names escape you. But this guy was a real character. By and large, the sciences resisted general education courses too. They still have them. Still have all the physical sciences in one course. And all the,
well, I don't know about all of them. Lots of different general education courses.
they're moving the floor is going to collapse in this corner any minute now.
It's possible.
Yeah. Anyway, that was Larry Dennis's big big cause. And before the Peace Corps stole him from Penn State, he ran the academic part of the Peace Corps.
How many people were on the faculty in that?
14.
14.
Well, 14 later. I think there were 12, and I got 2 positions right away, but I think there were 12 when I came. 12 positions. And they were not paid very well. I mean, this is not, when I found out when I get a vacancy, I'd take that salary out. And one of the things that Larry did for me was to get me some money right away to make a trip to the Middle West, to the better journalism schools at that time were in the Middle West. We thought, he and I thought. I took his word for it. So I paid visits to Wisconsin, Illinois, Minnesota, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan State, and Northwestern. I think that was it. Now today that list wouldn't be appropriate, and I'm sure you'd have universities do that. But I didn't have to go west of Iowa to get to all the. We didn't go to Nebraska, for example. We didn't go to Stanford. We didn't go to Berkeley, places like that. I later would have gone included, but I didn't at the time. But
This was in your first year, Gene, or
first year,
in '57 then?
57, 58.
And this is, I mean, you've told us about this trip before. I mean, it sounds like it sounds, first of all, it sounds fairly important. It was a director in search of a mission for a journalism school then, and so I mean, if you spend a little bit of time on that, how it came about, and what formed your thinkings from that on that trip.
Well, first I want to make clear that if historians ever write any of this stuff, that it's Larry Dennis's insight into what was going on in the world that was responsible for it. I would never have conceived of I was so busy just learning Penn State's way of doing things, I couldn't have thought that it would be important to go outside. But he could see that I needed to do that. But we picked the schools, and he helped me put together the letter that I sent to the directors or deans, whatever the titles of the people were. And they were very cooperative. Every place I went, they really just kind of opened everything up to me. And the faculty most of the faculty were very, very open and honest about it. And they told me all sorts of stuff. Stuff that I was told later they hadn't confessed to anybody. They hadn't told the deans or their colleagues about. Ideas they had, for the way that curriculum ought to be changed here and there, the way things ought to work, that they weren't able to push through. Ideas that had been shelved because they couldn't get any support on their own group, that I later put in effect at Penn State, and I would write these. I stole some of these people, as a matter of fact. I met Marlowe Folk on that trip, for example, that's how I got him. I met Vince Dorris on that trip, too. Vince, was a little more troublesome when he got here than Marlowe. But both of those guys were brilliant compared to the kind of people we had at Penn State on our faculty, and they accomplished things here that I think of.
Marlowe was at Illinois, right?
Yeah, he was. They were both at Illinois. He was not a graduate student at the time. He was working. He was teaching, and he had a newscast on their educational TV station. So I saw him on the air before I met him. Good newscaster. Very serious guy. You could tell it was unusual for the kind of news. News was just developing on television. It could have gone in any direction. If it had gone Marlowe's way, we'd all be a hell of a lot better off than we are today. And it didn't. I mean, he was very serious, and he had a thoughtful way about him. You just tell this guy was unusual. Anyway, when I met him, we hit it off right away, and I got him in a couple of years. I couldn't get him right away, but I got him. I made a little to get this one. So the first television newsman we hired to teach our television courses was Marlowe Folk, who then stolen away from me by the necessities of building our own TV station here. But everybody that helped us. I want to tell you how quality does spread like margarine. When he came, nobody knew who Marlowe Folk was. He was just a guy from the Middle West, And then when they needed him, and I found out what the need was, I was called in by the president and whoever the vice president for continuing ed was at that time. Anyway, they were interested in trying to get the broadcast license. And they want to know how I could help. Well, I said I could help. I could go down to Washington and help lobby, but I didn't know any of the technicality stuff. But I got a guy on the faculty who knows all about that stuff. Well, I don't know whether he did or not. but they started consulting Marlowe, and Marlowe did know a hell of a lot about that stuff. It wasn't just that he wasn't just a news guy. He paid attention to everything. You know how he is. He absorbs it to this day. He is that way. Well, they later on I can't tell you the number of times the president or other department heads who had to deal with him in those days would think, "How did you find this guy?" They'd say, "What a wonderful find," you know. And it reflected well on the school, which we needed in those days. We were not regarded as being the academically strongest place to be in this university back in 1957.
Gene, I don't want to knock you off your stride on the
You're done. I'm not on it.
on the trip, but there's a sub question there that it's always interested me. What and we talked about Bill Cole and now Marlowe and Marlowe Froke and Vince Norris. Mm-hmm. There always seems to have been a rather strong connection between Penn State and Illinois.
That was because, I can tell you about that. It was because of Jay Jensen and Ted Peterson. Ted Peterson was a friend of Larry. He and Larry worked together at Kansas State. So when I went to...
This is Larry Dennis.
Yeah, so I went to Illinois. Ted had this sort of special introduction from Larry. So they were pals. They respected one another. And here's a guy from out of nowhere who's going to run the school of journalism, just what Ted's needed. He needed somebody to teach how to run a school of journalism. And God, what an interesting person. And Jay Jensen, the philosopher of that group, you know, the great teacher, the great creator, I think, of most creative mind I had run into on what we mean by communications and why we ought to be teaching it as communications and not journalism and advertising and all that crap, you know. Not there's a little professional offspring, but why we had a core of knowledge here that was important to preserve and teach and everything, which I had never even thought of. You see, this is all new to me. And Wilbur Schramm introduced us to it a little bit when I was a graduate student there, but it didn't stick. It didn't stick with me. I don't want to blame him, but I think he was too busy also with his learning to be administrator too, which he never did do very well. But Ted and I, and Ted particularly, became very close friends right up until the time he died. And he introduced me to Jim Carey. Jim Carey is one of the most intelligent, thoughtful people in communications education that I know of. Those are all Illinois people. Of course, Schramm went there too, you know. So I'm all connected. But I wasn't the core. I'm just the observer. I'm picking brains from the side all the time. But I would say that it was Ted and Jay who turned me on to what I later tried to persuade the people at Penn State to see as the role of communications in this university here. I wrote a couple of pieces, essays, I call them, that were written for their ears only, were misinterpreted by the enemies of mine outside. They used against me. Why a school of communications? I don't know whether that's still around or not. I don't know what it was in the Penn State room of the library. Anybody ever go there? My wife was working out
essay.
Go there now.
why a school of communications? I wonder if it's still up there. Marlon knows
What year?
About 1950, 60, 61, 62 in there. Early 60s. Marlowe,
And it was published in what?
it wasn't published, I just wrote it.
Oh, okay.
But it's in the archives up in the Penn State.
Yeah, it later was in the archives because it became part of the fight over the accreditation and all that stuff. And but it lived, it survived, and Marlowe would tell you it became the document that on that study committee that resulted that he used to sell the other people on the notion of what communication, why we were calling it, what it is we meant when we called it communications, and what the knowledge was that we were talking about. And it was just an argument that if we looked at economics and politics and all that stuff the way we did, if we looked at communications the way we do the economics and politics and other important orders in the life of human beings, that we would find there was a role there that we were neglecting. We were not teaching well because we didn't recognize that sort of arguments. You know, you've heard it before. It's all hat now, but it was all new then. And I got most of those ideas from Ted and Jay, sitting around drinking with those guys in bars in the Drake Hotel in Chicago. Part of it was during meetings with accreditation, which both he got me involved in too. here at the unaccredited school, we got in trouble, but as a result of the trouble, I ended up being an important member of the accrediting committee who sent to all the trouble spots. Because Goodwin's been through it, he can take care of trouble. So I got sent to the NYUs and the Boston colleges and the Michigan States that were experimenting with new stuff at the time. Some of them not well, I want to tell you. Some of it was not valid stuff at all. So we ended up, I'll tell you about some quarrels we had with that sometime.
Before we go to the accreditation issue, let's go back to the 1957 trip, and you went to these different. I sidetracked you and wanted to know what the link was with Illinois, but how did that trip and what on that trip formed your view and leading to the way I understand it, the conclusion that ethics and social responsibility ought to be a major thrust or focus of the school?
I don't know how much of it was me and how much of it was what I was picking up from people, but Illinois comes first because of the fact they introduced me to the whole notion of communications as an order in the world. I had never thought about that before, and when you start thinking that way, things begin to fit together. So that's important. The ethics and social responsibility stuff, it comes out of my own upbringing, I guess, my own feelings about the way journalism was being practiced at the time. It sure as hell hasn't improved any. It's gone downhill as far as I can tell. You know my views on that. And I could see an important role for universities and journalism education as being a critic of this professional field to try to keep it on the straight and narrow. And I didn't see anybody doing that. I thought Penn State could maybe fill a role there. And I don't know that we did or not, but that was my notion that would be an important thing for us to do here, a special thing that we could do at Penn State. So when I hired people, I would try to hire people that have that sort of feel for the field in which they would be teaching. Advertising, Vince Norris was sure as hell a critic, super critic of the way advertising is practiced. John Harrison, who came here from the Toledo Blade after a few years at Iowa. Remember, he went to Iowa as a publisher of the Daily Iowan to start with. And he ended up being a teacher there, an unusual teacher, but he had a strong sense of the social responsibility of the press. And so that became sort of, without it being written down too much or my making a big thing, it became sort of a mission of mine. And I can just tell you, as I flew around I flew to places that are still dangerous to fly to this day. Bloomington, Indiana, I'm told it's still hard to fly in and out of, and certainly coming into state college is an experience still. But in those days, I was flying on these little planes that, I forget the name, something like Central Gonzaga Airlines and things like that. It run 2 trips a day. They'd run from Danville to Bloomington. So it was dangerous. And I'd get off these shaky planes, and they kind of have to make 3 passes before they could land. They touched down and decided there wasn't enough runway to go. Crazy trip. But I had a tape recorder, and I kept sending these tapes back to my secretary here, who spent full time just transcribing those things. When I came back, I had 100 pages at least of stuff to go through, and she was single spacing too. It was not double spaced. She complained about the waste of paper, I remember. So I made a lot of notes and formed a lot of impressions. And I can't even remember now some of the people who were involved, but all of them contributed their ideas. Simple thing. I remember a guy at Michigan State, for example, who later stuck in my mind because it happened so often. He had a box sitting up on top of his file cabinet. I maybe told you the story. And I was looking at it, what's that? He said, that's my, some people call it dead letters, but that's my dead memo file. Whenever I get angry and I write a memo to the dean, he says, I think about it. Before I send it, I throw it up there for a day. And then I take it down the next day, and I usually put it right back up there and leave it because I decide I better not send it afterward. But it's good for me to say it, to get it off my chest. And this kind of sort of diplomacy didn't stick with me for a while, but I learned to do it myself after a while. That's not part of my nature. I like to shoot from the hip. You can't do that. You can't run a school of journalism or anything in the academy and shoot from the hip all the time. You can't be a John Wayne type and succeed. So I had to learn that the hard way. That's a personal thing. But I learned a lot about how there was a great deal of disagreement on how it ought to be, how stuff ought to be taught. Simple thing like how to write ought to be taught. You'd think there'd be agreement on that, but no, there was beginning to be the laboratory sort of thing where you'd have students involved in trying to describe things that they saw or that they experienced themselves, and sort of show and tell whether that really worked, whether you ought to have put out a newspaper or a magazine, you know. And all the schools were troubled, all the people who were serious about writing, and I was one of those, had disagreements about how it ought to be taught. And I pulled all together and came back with my ideas, most of which were enforced here at Penn State over the dead bodies of some of the faculty members. It involved eliminating some courses and recreating them. That was hard to do. That's how we lost the accreditation. I started pushing right after that for that. I started pushing for simple changes to start with. This was not to get communications. I was on the side, I was working on this concept, but I couldn't with the faculty I had. If I'd succeeded in that first 2 or 3 arguments with the presidents and the deans around here, I wouldn't have had a faculty to teach any of this stuff, you know. So these were just ideas I had to let grow till I could get. Vince was important to me. Once I got Vince, he knew what I was talking about. In fact, many of these ideas are his ideas. I mean, he fed that in that document that I wrote, Why School Journalism, Why There's a Need for School Communications, and other people who, not all of whom stayed here. That's about. I'm trying to get in the 10 minutes what you're asking. It was important. It was an important trip.
We have we're running down on the tape. We've got a backup tape, right? If we could go a little bit longer, you just have to. Okay. Because I think we'd probably want to go a little bit more. I mean, how you doing, Gene? You need.
I'm doing fine. I'm not keeping track, but I tend to get windy, as you know. So.
Well, let's go till we run out this tape, and then maybe go a few more minutes into the next day.
Yeah, I'll be glad to.
So, anything more on the trip and the ethics and social responsibility and mission that jumps to mind?
I think the social responsibility and ethics is really comes out of my feeling about the way the profession of journalism was operating at the time I was in it, and I was beginning to think about those matters at the end of my. I've been in the field about 12 years when I came here, and it was time that you started thinking about whether what you were doing was good for the human race. And I was beginning to doubt some stuff that we were taking for granted in the field. So I carried that doubt into the practice. And whenever I had a chance to talk to publishers and editors, I tried to get them to look at their own practices, their own ways of doing things, including some of the stuff they did in advertising. I didn't know anything about advertising, but I could tell when they were cheating people. And I used to embarrass them sometimes, and once in a while they'd change. Once in a while you'd get a little goal achieved here and there. Somebody would change the way of doing things. But I think that came more out of. I was open to that thought. If anybody contributed to it, it would probably be Ted, because he has it. You know, he wrote the social responsibility section of the 4 Theories of the Press. He had that same view. He wrote that on assignment more than anything else, so he'll admit that.
From Schramm.
Yeah. Like I did my thesis, my master's thesis. It's funny, it was the same boss. But Ted knew what he was writing about, and that was an important book. You remember that 4 Theories? Anybody still talk about the 4 Theories?
Actually,
I do, yeah.
Really?
I still assign it to some classes
Isn't that
as a classic work, and sometimes you have to put it in context. You know, kids in 2005 saying, "What am I reading this for?"
Yeah, 50 years old it is.
Well, but that's interesting. So a good deal of your, or at least some of your views and your focus on ethics and social responsibility at Penn State comes from your friendship with Ted Peterson.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, he was the guy. He was the guy who would try out new stuff. We had to go to a lot of conventions, not just journalism education. We were involved in accreditation, and we used, in those days, I don't know whether this is true, the directors of schools of journalism, deans and directors used to go off to meetings of the American Society and Newspaper Editors and American Newspaper Publishers Association's conventions. As we were usually guests at those things. We had to pay our own way, but I mean, we were admitted to sessions and conventions and that sort of thing. And we'd have our own little rump sessions. My rump sessions were with Ted Peterson, mostly, because he was the guy whose brains I was most interested in picking. And he found me an amiable companion. The best guy. He used to say the guy he liked to travel most with. He liked his idea of a convention was to get called out of the room. Sometimes he would even tip a bellboy in a hotel to page him so he could leave. So I think he had something important to do, so we'd get the hell out of there and we'd go buy records. He's a great jazz fan like that. Go buy records and talk about important things. And now we didn't do this when it was something important. We never did it. We never missed a meeting of the American Council on Education for Journalism. They called the accreditation council. We sat, but his other thing is he's a great cartoonist, and he would sit there and doodle. He'd draw these wonderful cartoons. He'd have these two fish meeting in the sea before Nemo. This is before Nemo, and he'd have the funny captions. Who are you, sir? My name is Donald, sir. And he'd go on down. He'd draw the whole strip before the meeting was over. Then he'd give it to me. I still have some of those. I reproduce them once in a while. Yeah, they're in a book that his widow has put out last year. Did you ever see that book Helen Peterson wrote?
No.
Well, it's really her attempt to do a autobiography of her life, but she couldn't do it without. She couldn't that wasn't very interesting to the publisher, but the little publisher could see in Ted's cartoons a promise of maybe a little money. So there's a lot of Ted's cartoons, and I gave her some of those that would never have been published. He'd never use them he used to send Christmas. You ever see his Christmas cards?
No.
Well, he used to he'd make up these funny Santa Claus. My favorite one was a fireplace with stockings hanging, and there's smoking and non-smoking stockings. And the smoking sections is very small, and the non-smoking sections are very large. At the time we were going through that, he was very, very. Sense of humor that I appreciated. So we got along very well together. I learned a lot from Ted. And I'm sorry, toward the end of his life, I couldn't, and I got out of administration, so we didn't meet as often. But it was because the deans and directors do that. You think you're wasting money when they go off to a convention. It's not being wasted if it was with Ted Peterson and people like me. We got our money's worth. If you didn't see us at the meetings, that wasn't because we weren't learning. And he was a good guy. And he used to sit around and he'd say, "What the hell are we doing this for? It's journalism education. It's a waste of time, isn't it?" And they'd make me answer questions like that. Well, I don't know, Ted. Think about all the things you could do with life. You could collect garbage. I sort of philosophical discussion would go on forever. He was basically an unhappy Dane. They are. They get very unhappy, very dour.
Is that a redundancy?
Yeah. He had a lot of death wishes. I never had him. He needed a guy like me. You need an upbeat person around to keep him going. God bless him. But go ahead.
Maybe it's a good time to take a break and change the tape.
How you doing, guys? Besides being bored to death.